And I think the final thing that people often don't mention when talking about listening comprehension, and it's so critical, is you finally develop the ability to anticipate what's about to be said. Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel, and I'm really excited to share with you today a nice little story of something that happened to me with my Mandarin Chinese studies just like an hour ago. And this brings up a really great topic, I think, which is this question of, can you ever really truly get comfortable understanding like basically anything in your target language, right? And in particular, I want to highlight a very specific type of content. Content is a bit of a strange word here, but let me explain. It's that I think anyone who has learned a foreign language to the point where you can start really conversing with native speakers, and in this case, I'm using the word native speaker quite deliberately, you will find that when you talk to a native speaker one-on-one, you start to actually get pretty comfortable, right? You start to get to this place where you're actually able to understand. You might even get to a place where it's now pretty easy. You can really comfortably have a conversation one-on-one with a native speaker. And then, many of you will relate to this. You find yourself in a situation where now there are three of you, right? It's you and two native speakers. Or maybe you're watching a TV drama where there's just a whole bunch of native speakers. Or you're listening to a podcast, maybe it's an interview. The point is you start to realize that listening to two or more native speakers talk to each other is way more difficult than talking to a native speaker one-on-one, right? And you can even think to your own experience as a native speaker of your mother tongue, perhaps speaking to people who have learnt your language or are studying it. We just talk a different way. Unless you have really, truly excellent language skills and you're able to instill a very high degree of confidence in the person you're talking to, you know, giving them confidence that you're going to understand pretty much anything. For the most part, native speakers, when talking to learners of their language, they will just simply adjust the way that they speak, right? Now, even if you're really advanced, right, and they know you've got a high level in the language, we just tend to adjust, right? We tend to maybe not use certain words or cultural references or slang terms or colloquialisms that we think you probably won't understand, right? We just naturally often slightly adjust our language so that you're more likely to be able to converse with us. And you know, when two native speakers talk to each other, it's just like all the barriers are taken off, right? They just tend to talk so much more quickly. They tend to just mumble and blend words together. They might be laughing. They might be really enthusiastically talking. They might be dropping all sorts of jokes and references and slang terms and all sorts of stuff. And it's just harder, right? It's just harder. I think that my Mandarin Chinese now is at a really interesting place where I'm very well positioned to try to tackle that question for you, because I think that for a lot of people, if you reach my current level in Mandarin, which we'll talk about in a second, it's both very exciting, very encouraging, very motivating, and also at the same time, it can be very demotivating and very worrying. It can be a place where you start to really doubt yourself. And here's why. So in Mandarin, for me right now, and I just made a video just a couple weeks ago, all in Mandarin, giving an update. It's got English subtitles. And if you want to see where my Mandarin is, you can check it out. You can read the comments from other learners and native speakers to see the feedback that I got. So I made an update. So where I am right now is that I'm really starting to get, like, I think I'm at a pretty good upper intermediate level. This is just my self-assessment, and I'm not even necessarily being specific when it comes to B1 or B2 versus C1. Like, I'm just saying the way that I feel is I feel like I'm starting to get into like a fairly decent middle to upper intermediate level. In terms of expressing myself, I'm getting actually somewhat comfortable for the first time doing so in Mandarin, right? I'm actually not as scared anymore to just go for it, to talk to somebody. If someone speaks to me in Mandarin, I'm not like freezing up and saying, oh God, I hope I can do this. I'm more and more comfortable expressing myself. I'm starting to get more comfortable with more complex sentence structures. And at the same time though, I do still have the occasional problem with rather simple stuff. Certain structures in particular, I get stuck on a little bit. And then with vocabulary, I find that I'm now starting to really expand my vocab a lot into the more intermediate and advanced words. I'm learning a lot of really cool colloquial phrases, lots of really great slang terminology, and I'm starting to get more comfortable just choosing the correct words at the correct situation. However, similarly, I do still find that, yeah, I may actually just like not be able to think of a pretty simple word occasionally. And I am occasionally coming across words still that I just haven't seen. Like I just saw the word for ice cream a few weeks ago. And I couldn't believe like, wow, I've never seen the word for ice cream. So that's where I am. I'm at this phase where I'm definitely starting to expand certain parts of my language skills into what you might call like advanced level language, meaning learning words that certainly fall into that category, learning a lot of things, but I still do have like those gaps in the intermediate and maybe even some beginner stuff where I'm just still patching up those gaps, still filling them in. And so what happened to me this morning is I went out on a walk, as I do every day, and I listened to a podcast. It's a podcast called, what is it called? 打个电话给你. And it translates to, I think they translate it to one call away. And I tried listening to it a few months ago. And back then, I found that I was mostly just able to catch words. So I would catch quite a lot of words at that point, but mostly just words or very, very small chunks of language. Now, a few months before that, I was trying to listen to a podcast called Bear Talk. And at that time, it was mostly just words. So there were much fewer and further between, and I occasionally would understand like maybe half a sentence or perhaps a whole sentence, but it was very, very hard to follow. With this podcast a few months ago, I was mostly just words, more and more frequent, but I was so hard to follow. And then today, something really special happened because I've been working really hard on my Mandarin these last few weeks, this last month, getting to a really exciting place. I was really surprised. I was listening to a new episode of the podcast. I will link to both the podcast and the specific episode in the description. I listened to it on Spotify. To my surprise, the topic was toxic productivity, right? Two native speakers talking to each other. This is intended for a native audience, right? This is full on as it gets. But I was actually able to understand entire chunks of language, right? Like they weren't just single words for the most part. In fact, in almost every case, I rarely only understood like just one word. If I understood something, I understood like multiple words, maybe even a chain of 6, 7, 8, 9 words back to back. Then there was a few that I couldn't grasp, and there was a chunk I did get. So I found two things. The chunks of language I was able to catch, they were larger than before, and they were also more frequent. And so it was this point where I could actually, for the most part, sort of follow what was going on. Certainly there were pieces where I understood exactly what was going on, but then there were stretches where I just got lost and I couldn't quite follow anymore. What I did find is that it was hard to keep up cognitively. So I would understand like a pretty big chunk, gap, big chunk, gap. And on one hand, I was super excited, like, wow, I understood what they just said. But then the next chunk came, and the next chunk came, and the next chunk came. These are all chunks I'm understanding. And it was almost like it was hard to hold the context of the previous 30 seconds or so, and then continue understanding new stuff and like weaving it together. So like I was understanding more than I was able to keep up with at that speed. So that's my little story, and it's very, very exciting, and it's very relevant to this question we started with. Can you ever get to the point where you can just understand that stuff? Because I actually think if Chinese was my first language I had learned as an adult, I think at this moment I would definitely be questioning myself. I think for the last 3 or 4 months, 6 months, I would have been questioning myself. Like, do you ever get to the point where you can really truly understand this stuff? You know, like sometimes you're watching a TV drama, you see the subtitles, you see what they said, but when you listen to it, you're like, how would anyone actually really understand that? Like, am I ever gonna get there? Or is the highest level I'll ever reach that point where I can understand native speakers one-on-one, but I'm just lost when I hear the real, true native content, whether that's on a TV screen, through headphones, or in person? And so the answer is yes, you totally can. And a lot of you will probably know that. A lot of you watching may have done this before, right? But the point is, a lot of people haven't done it. A lot of people haven't got to that point yet in any target language. And I think that it is a very high level. I do personally think, this is just my personal opinion and my personal experience, this is like one of the later things you finally accomplish in a foreign language. I found in Japanese, for example, even when I got to a really comfortable place, I mean very comfortable talking to native speakers one-on-one, or maybe even two-on-one, when I watched a TV drama or listened to that kind of a incredibly enthusiastic, spontaneous conversation between people, I would still really struggle. And I would ask myself, am I ever gonna get there? So that's why I wanted to bring this up. I wanted to first of all just answer that question and give you hopefully confidence and self-belief, if you haven't done this yet, that you totally can get there. And it's a really beautiful journey. And the second part is I wanted to give you an insight into what that journey actually looks like. It's very similar to what's happening to me right now in Mandarin. At one point, you're now finally able to actually catch words if you listen to that kind of native content. Later on, you find that you simply catch more and more words, but you're still really struggling to follow along. Then you start to find that you're kind of actually grasping entire chunks of language, but they're small chunks and they're few and far between. You then get to where I am right now in Mandarin, where you're like, oh my gosh, the chunks are actually larger. I'm understanding larger pieces of language together, and they're starting to happen more frequently now. I'm starting to actually be able to follow along with certain pieces or parts of this episode or this conversation, but I still get lost and then I struggle to catch up again. And then at this point, you also might find, like I am, that you start to actually understand more than you're able to keep up with, right? And so there's a process which you can do extensive reading and all sorts of stuff to help with this. There's a period where part of the stuff that you're trying to work on is your ability to understand things, but also hold that context and keep taking in new stuff while following along with the global sort of topic of the conversation. And then it kind of just continues. And I think the final thing that people often don't mention when talking about listening comprehension, and it's so critical, is you finally develop the ability to anticipate what's about to be said. And this is what helps you when sometimes things really are just so mumbled. Sometimes people just talk so fast and they just kind of trip over their own words and keep going. The difference is that native speakers, for example, very often, if you're following along, you kind of can guess the next word, right? A lot of times if you pause some content in your native language, you can guess very often what the next word is going to be. That anticipation is really helpful in plugging in any gaps that actually are kind of incomprehensible or kind of mumbled. And I think that's kind of the overall journey, very broadly speaking, of reaching that place where you can just follow pretty much anything. And it's a beautiful journey, and I encourage you to embrace it, enjoy it. Don't wish you could skip it, don't wish it away, enjoy it. But I just most of all want to let you know you absolutely can get there, and you will if you just keep going. So good luck to everybody, have a fantastic day. Let's all keep going, learning languages, and I'll see you soon.